My grandmother was a refugee. When she was 14, her world fell apart. It was the middle of World War II, and she and her family had to flee from Burma and make the long, hard trek over the mountains to India. Now, when my cousins and I were small children, we used to beg her to tell us that story of the journey. We would sit in a circle around her, she would feed us Burmese food that she still enjoyed making, and we would listen. To us, it was a tale of adventure and excitement. There were nighttime rides on the river. There were villains who tried to rob the family. There were daring rescues and miraculous escapes. It was so exciting. It was better than any adventure novel. But as I grew up, I learned to listen between the lines to the pain of leaving behind everything that she knew, heading towards an uncertain future. The dangers of that wartime journey, and the heartbreak and grief of losing a beloved older sister to illness along the way. They had to bury her in an unknown grave in the mountains. But perhaps less dramatic, but more traumatic than that was what came at the end of the journey. You see, my grandmother and her family were originally from India. They were Tamils who had migrated to Burma 3 generations earlier, and all they knew was Burma. None of them had ever seen India. Her father was a well-respected municipal commissioner in the town. They lived in a big teak house. At 14, my grandmother wore short skirts, went to a British school, and played tennis and competed in athletics. The world they fled to was completely different. They were dependent for food and shelter on distant relatives whom they barely knew. My grandmother had to exchange her short skirts for wearing a half sari at 14. And certainly there was no place for a young girl to learn tennis in southern India of the 1940s. When I was a young journalism student in Chennai at 20, I met another refugee. She must have been about 16. Let's call her Rani. Now, Rani and her family had fled from Sri Lanka from the war there when she was a young child, and they were among the thousands of refugees housed in refugee camps across the state of Tamil Nadu. And the government was just starting to talk about repatriation. Now, Rani's mother and those of her generation in the camp told me a story that is very common to refugees across time, whether from Burma of the 1940s or Sri Lanka of the 1990s or the Syrians today, Syrian refugees who dominate the headlines today. It's a story of the horrors of wartime, the risk they took to their lives in trying to get out, and once things got better, how desperately, desperately they wanted to go back home. But I heard the true echoes of my grandmother's story in what Rani told me. Rani was a young teenager. She barely remembered life in Sri Lanka. Her entire world was India. She enjoyed Indian food. She knew Indian customs. She had big dreams of going to college in India. To think of Sri Lanka, she didn't even know what she could dream of in Sri Lanka. And so when I went back with my report, it focused on a young girl watching her world fall apart, facing an unknown future. Your topic here at TEDx today is Imbibe, Innovate, Impart, right? And I've been a journalist for well over a decade, so I suppose I fit firmly into the impart section of things, right? I'm a professional storyteller. It's my passion, it's my profession, it's what I do. I impart. But I've learned over the years that if I begin with imparting, whether it's information, stories, analysis, whatever, before I do the imbibing, I'm in deep trouble. And it sounds simple, right? You have to listen to a story before you can tell it. Everyone knows that. But it's astonishing how often we are bad at doing just that, and how serious are the implications when we fail. When I looked up the definition of the word in the dictionary, the first definition you see is to drink, alcohol. They were imbibing far too many pitchers of beer. I don't suppose that's the kind of imbibing you're advocating here at TEDx today. The second definition, of course, is to absorb or to assimilate ideas or knowledge. Right? And that's the kind of imbibing that so often we are bad at doing. We hear stories, but we fail to listen to them. We don't absorb stories to assimilate them into how we see the world, into our knowledge of the world. Imbibing it's a multi-sensory verb. It's important to look deeply, to listen well, sometimes to even live out a story, to almost taste it at the back of your mouth before you can tell it. I have a confession to make. I'm not used to speaking without notes usually, and so I'd intended to spend this morning session practicing so that I knew how I was going to do this. And then I thought how hypocritical to spend the time talking to myself instead of listening to the stories which were being shared here on stage this morning. And it was truly rewarding. There were powerful stories shared. So you see, this isn't just about me and my fellow journalists, professional storytellers. We're standing here today in a law university. Many of you are law students. You're about to enter the judicial system of the country, right? And the system for justice in this country. And at the heart of justice is truth. Truth is what we seek to uphold in the courts of law. Truth is, I hope, the basis of journalism. Truth lies at the foundation of any just society. And when we fail to listen properly, we fail to hear truth. And that is the first step in denying justice to those who need it most. Let me go back to journalism to tell you what the implications can look like when we fail to listen properly. One of my first news articles as a national news reporter covering environmental issues was about Vedanta. Now, Vedanta is a multinational mining company which was set up an alumina refinery here in Odisha in the Kalahandi district. And they originally intended to source their raw materials by mining the nearby Niyamgiri hills. There were people who were for the project, hoping for industry and development and jobs that region needed badly, and there were those who were against the project, foreseeing pollution and deforestation. And most importantly, local Adivasi people were firmly against the project because they saw the Niyamgiri hills as sacred, as their god. And about 400 people had turned up, and 27 people spoke. And they'd recorded the statements of these 27 people. Of the 27, 17 were completely against the project. They were opposed to it. There were 9 who were on the fence. Some of them, they felt that they would welcome the opportunities for employment, but they worried that the company was not keeping its promises on pollution and on giving jobs to locals. And one person out of the 27 was completely in favor of the project. So 17, 9, and 1. Let me quote from the record of that report. They said that we have given Vedanta our motherland and it has given nothing back. They said that the unit is polluting the surroundings and we will hold an andolan, a protest. They said that the hill is our mother. The villagers will never agree. And it goes on and on like this for about 6 pages of statements. And after these 6 pages of mostly passionate opposition, which was faithfully recorded by these 2 officials, these same 2 officials concluded that report with a single concluding statement. And it says, the overall opinion of the public about the project was favorable, provided the proponent takes care of their issues. I have to wonder, what were those officials listening to? They had heard the stories, they'd heard the statements against it, but they chose to completely disregard it. They deliberately wiped them out. After about a decade of protests and legal cases back and forth, last year the Supreme Court, in a final verdict, came down in favor of the tribals and against the government and the company. But I wonder in the process, how many stories were erased? How many never even came to light? There are other subtler ways of erasing stories. For example, it can depend on who is telling the story, who you're listening to tell the story. I saw an example of this, sadly, in a police station, which is supposed to be the first building block of our judicial system. I was accompanying a group of government officials and NGOs in a rescue of people who had been trafficked for labor. This was in Kanchipuram district in southern Tamil Nadu, and these were also Adivasi people, poor illiterates, and after the rescue, we headed to the police station to file an FIR, right? The first information report. This is the first official recording of a story, the first listening. in a criminal case. And it was the middle of the night, so the police invited the NGO social workers to come in, to sit down, to have a cup of tea while the forms were being filled. But they wanted to leave the Adivasi families outside, in the dark, sitting on the hard ground. Later, when the owners, the employers turned up, they were also invited in to have their say. And so ultimately, the police could say that they had told both sides. They'd listened to both sides of the story. There was no bias. They'd listened to the social workers speak on behalf of the victims, and the owners speak on behalf of the oppressors. But they hadn't actually listened to the laborers, to the Adivasis, tell their own story. And if the NGO hadn't insisted, it wouldn't have happened. One of the police officers asked me, what could they possibly have to say? They're illiterate tribals. They know nothing. I have to admit that as a journalist, I'm often guilty of that kind of listening. It's lazy, but it's easy to listen to the spokesperson, the activist, the social worker, rather than to hear the story directly, the inside story, directly from those who have the right to tell it. Don't get me wrong, there's value in being a voice for the voiceless victim, but we would hear truth better, do justice better, if we would give a voice to the voiceless victims themselves. And perhaps we would start best by not labeling them victims at all. Let me tell you about Ria. Now, I could tell you that Ria is the victim of sex trafficking in Mumbai and the terrible circumstances that brought her there, and it would be true. But when I met Ria, I was working on a project for an anti-trafficking NGO with a very talented photographer named Nikhil Roshan, and we listened to her tell a story that went well beyond victimization. She told us how after she had gotten out of that situation, she had completed school, she'd completed a technical certification, and she was working, she'd just gotten a job working in the shipyard, the Bombay shipyard, and she was so proud of herself. She lived with a group of friends in a PG, and they enjoyed walking down Marine Drive and eating ice cream. Now, the law requires that we don't show the faces, the facial features of sex trafficking victims. And so photographers have to work around that. And on that project, Nikhil had done it several ways. You can take photos of the back of a person. You can take photos in silhouette so that you're against the light and the face isn't seen. But in India especially, one of the most common ways is because Indian women wear a sari or a dupatta or a chunni, is to have the woman cover her head and cover her face, perhaps with only the eyes showing or even the eyes veiled, right? It's a convenient way. But we found that having heard Ria's story, we couldn't portray her simply as a victim. And so instead, Nikhil shot this. It's still using the scarf. But this isn't the portrait of a victim. It's not the portrait of bondage. It's a picture of freedom. It's Ria's own story, the truth without labels. It can be hard to hear stories that are far from our own experience, to discover that truth goes well beyond what we personally know. Especially for those of us raised in urban India, the stories of rural India can seem too far, linguistically, geographically, in every way. And veteran journalist P. Sainath has been trying to bridge that gap for decades and recently started a project called The People's Archive of Rural India. He and his team have been trying to record and absorb and imbibe the stories of the villages and put them online. And recently they started a project to record the songs that village women sing as they work with their grind mills, right? Grinding grain or spices or whatever. As motorized grinding comes in, that's being lost. And they're looking to capture these songs, and they're putting about 1 lakh of them online. You should listen. To a city girl raised on rap, rock, and YouTube, those songs can feel like they come from a different world. And yet, if we don't listen, if we don't absorb the stories of rural India, we simply will not be able to build a just society. One of my favorite TED Talks is by the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I hope I've pronounced it right. And she speaks on the dangers of a single story. Right? And one of her examples is of how the Western world sees Africa, the single story of a continent of conflict, corruption, and poverty. And we in India are familiar with that kind of stereotyping, right? For a long time, the Western world saw us as an exotic land of snake charmers and elephants, of beggars and rajas. And that's fast changing as we export the stories of software companies, of modern development, of Bollywood, alongside what happens when we live with some ancient prejudices, especially of caste and gender. But even as we expand the stories that we tell the rest of the world, I fear that we are narrowing the stories we tell ourselves. I worry that as a nation, we're trying to draw a billion very different people into the straitjacket of a single story. A single story of our history, of our religion, our culture, our language, and of our future path of development. And those who are left on the margins or outside the rigid outlines of this story are also too often left outside the safety net of justice. And so if the story that we hear is that India is a land of Hindus and Hindi-speaking peoples, then it becomes okay to treat those from other religions or other languages as second-class citizens, to impose the single story of the majority on many minorities. If, in our single story, the beautiful Indian woman is wheatish-skinned, whatever that means, has large eyes and is demure and modest, then it becomes okay to sell fair and lovely creams. It becomes okay to rape a girl in a short skirt. If the constant story we listen to is of growth and development so that India can become a global power, then we are in danger of drowning out the stories of those who face the cost of that growth, those dispossessed by development. In fact, it becomes anti-national to listen to those stories. And of course, if the story is that India is a land of vegetarians, then meat eaters don't really deserve justice, do they? It becomes okay to debate whether Muhammad Akhlaq had mutton or beef in his fridge, rather than to be appalled that a mob killed a man over his food habits. The stories we listen to are important. Whose stories we listen to is important. How we listen to them can change our world. We don't even always have to tell the stories we listen to in order for that listening to have impact. I have never before told in such a public fora the story of my grandmother, the refugee. Someday I hope to go to Burma to retrace her journey and to tell her story. But it was the very act of listening to her stories, of imbibing and absorbing them, that built in me the capacity for empathy, to hear other people's stories, to hear truth, to seek and to safeguard justice. Thank you for listening.